as requested, today my presentation is the history and evolution of acid house. The music and a bit about the movement and a little bit of sort of social context, but mainly the music. So, in the beginning, there was Kraftwerk. Yeah. So I've said arguably created the entire genre of electronic music, contentious, and I think people might say sort of BBC radiophonic workshop doing stuff. A lot, exactly, yeah. Certainly, one of the originators and genre-defining, built their own synthesizers. This is them doing a live show on TV in 1978, but they were doing stuff live on TV in 1970. You know, a decade before most people were thinking about doing anything with electronic music, and incredibly influential across the world. And so we're gonna get to acid house, but the country that took it up and was next to innovate was the US, and sort of most of the big electronic music innovations from then on came out of the US. So, you know, we've got we've got things like we've got disco going on, and producers like Giorgio Moroder producing Donna Summer, which is disco, but is, you know, shares a lot of elements with electronic music that will come after. Not really a lot of difference between this and some kinds of techno, I would say. So in the very early 80s in Detroit, people like Juan Atkins were starting to make electro. Definitely one of the precursors, inspired by Kraftwerk, inspired by funk, disco, and sort of starting to sound more like electronic music that we recognise as house music. So this is from 1983. I think, you know, to people then, just like Kraftwerk would have done in Germany in the 70s, this definitely would have sounded like music from the future. It wasn't, you know, there wasn't anything like this going on. And I don't think this is a clip from the time, but you can see the kind of dancing that it inspired.
You can hear it, you said every element of what it.
Yeah. And this is 1983. But very, sort of very contained, didn't take off. You know, some influential people hearing each other doing it, but very much underground subculture.
Do you think by the time, I think I first heard music like that in 1987, was that still subcultural?
We'll get to that, probably, hopefully. Tell me if I answer your question. But so still in the US, after Electro, which that last tune, Cybotron, would be called Electro usually, that turned into Techno, still in Detroit. And there's sort of social reasons for that, and Techno is usually credited to the Belleville 3. Juan Atkins, who did the Cybotron tune that we just heard, Derek May and Kevin Saunderson, and together they went to Belleville High School, and started making this music together. Took it from Electro through to Techno. Alvin Toffler's book, Future Shock, I wonder whether, I actually haven't read it, but I wonder whether either you two might have read it. Too much rapid change too soon is a sort of a one-sentence tagline of it, particularly post-industrial societies, and how just the pace of change and how people aren't equipped to handle that. And I think that's where the phrase, or the word techno comes from. He's got this idea of techno rebels, and I think that's what these guys from Detroit took on and decided to call music techno. Alvin Toffler talks about post-industrial societies. Detroit was going through massive social changes. It was already a big music city, Motown, so-called because it was a motor town. But by this time in the 80s, automation, competition from Japan and Germany meant that there was a huge decline in the motor industry. So Detroit was a shell of what it used to be. But out of that came this completely new form of music called techno. And I can't see my notes to where to jump to here. So it's a slightly more complex sound than the Electro. It's got some strings and things going on. Yeah, this is a 1987 classic techno track from Derek May. Well, yeah. So the next slide is about house, and techno came from house, as did acid house, obviously. And back then, probably nobody would have had the labels or made a distinction. Perhaps everything would have just been called house music. It's only kind of subsequently that these things get labelled and divided. But this is house or techno, yeah, you're right. So that was all happening in Detroit. In Chicago was where house was really invented, and again, all the things about names as well are particularly contentious. Nobody can really remember how these things came about, but or people disagree. Everyone's got their own versions. But the sort of accepted wisdom is that house music's called house music because it started in the club called the Warehouse in Chicago. And that opened in the late 70s, but sort of house music proper was starting there from early 80s. So that was going on in Chicago. Techno was going on in Detroit, and Future, who were three guys from Chicago, were listening to all of that and making what is usually credited as the first acid house record, which is this one. And it's quite long at 11 minutes, so we won't play the whole thing. We'll jump to GS. And what you can start to come in, what you can start to hear coming in there is the thing that defines acid house, which is this. It's that squelchy synthesizer noise. That's what separates acid house from the rest of the genres that we've been talking about. Why was it called? So this is the first acid track, and it's called Acid Tracks. Why was it called Acid Tracks? Nobody can really say for sure. Maybe it's after LSD use of the music box, the club that it was first played at. Maybe it sounds similar to acid rock from the 60s, some of the same sort of psychedelic sounds. Nobody knows. It's one of these things that you can remember why you probably weren't there. But again, still, still very, very underground. Played at some clubs in Chicago, kind of predominantly gay, black clubs, very far from the mainstream. No. I'm not surprised that this. I'm not surprised that this one isn't. Well, and so that squelchy noise, I should have thought of a way to leave it playing while I go to the next slide, but I haven't. So that squelchy noise comes from this machine here, the TB-303. And if it wasn't for that, there would be no such thing as acid house. So it was created in 1981 by Roland, who are a Japanese company who are responsible for all of the synthesizers and drum machines that make electronic music what it is. But it wasn't intended for that. It was intended, this is one of the original adverts from it, which is a well-known jazz musician set up with 3 Roland machines from the early 80s, the 303. So it's called TB-303 for transistorized bass. So it's supposed to be a bass accompaniment for guitarists, or in this case, jazz pianists. He's also got a little 606 there, which is one of the Roland drum machines. So they've got the whole range from 101 through to 909, variously drum machine synthesizers, all sort of taken over by dance music and repurposed. And it never took off for its original purpose, only made for 3 years, then discontinued. But a member of Future, Earl Spanky Smith, they've all got good names, bought one for $40 in a second-hand shop and started twiddling the knobs. And by twiddling with the knobs, so you get that completely unintentional, squelchy acid noise that is far from the bass guitar sound that Roland were intending.
You're going to explain how that works.
How the 303 works.
6 knobs at the top could do that to a sound for that.
No. Are you? If you hop in. I mean, it's an incredibly simple synth, single
So I'm not
oscillator.
exactly prepared, but you on this thing you would record a few bass notes. Boo, 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 something like that.
Well, so it had a sequencer built
Yes.
in, which was
Yes.
what allowed you to use it standalone. So you're absolutely right. I think you put something like 64 simple patterns in, and then use a sequencer to bring those patterns in and out. Set that going on its own while you twiddle the knobs
Yes.
and make it go.
And then the knobs are just distorting the sound envelope around each of the notes. So
Yep.
speeding it up, slowing it down, squashing its front or its back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
changing the
Shapes
parameters of the
waveforms
envelope.
and
Yeah.
so on. So it's fantastically simple, given the quality of the noise that can come out of it and the specialness of that sound. And you could write bits of software to do this in a very simple way in an afternoon.
I mean, you mentioned before this about software emulators
Yes.
of this, and you do get lots of this. You also get hardware emulators of it. People have tried to, because there's so few of them made, and Roland have never started making them again. Although they have made sort of modern equivalents, but the real acid house heads would say that it doesn't sound the same. It's something about those particular components that were used in that.
Entirely analog
Yeah.
circuitry.
Yeah. There's a company that tries to recreate them from as close to possible as the same components. I haven't looked at this for a while, but last time I did look at them, there was a massive waiting list to get hold of it. It's really hard for them to source enough enough of these components. And they're incredibly expensive now, considering what they are, which is like a really cheap Casio keyboard, but you couldn't get one for less than £1,000.
It's this small.
Yeah.
Very small, inconsequential.
Yeah. Cheap plastic housing, takes batteries, and how many of them have been destroyed through the batteries just leaking inside. Yeah. But that's it was this that created acid house. So this was going on in the US and still very small. Meanwhile, in the UK, a group of London DJs went on holiday to Ibiza in 1987 and went to the clubs out there, which were probably some of the first clubs in Europe to have imported the Chicago sound and acid house sound, and discovered MDMA, ecstasy, which was being taken in clubs in Ibiza, and brought all of that back to the UK, started various clubs around London, Manchester, including Shoom, probably one of the first ones, and people in the UK started making music. And unlike in the US, this quickly became pretty mainstream. So tracks like this, Voodoo Ray, were in the charts. And it quickly became adopted by the youth culture in the UK in a way that it never did in the US. The next one that we're going to hear, which is another 808 State from Manchester, again 1988. This was the one I think that led Chris to ask me to do this talk. So yeah, rave culture took off, became mainstream. The clubs that got started were so small that they couldn't house the people that wanted to get into them. So people who couldn't get into these clubs every weekend would do a rave in a field or in an abandoned warehouse. I guess there's that same sense of sort of post-industrial decline. This time in the UK, yeah, you know, factors at war with the unions, and yeah, industry is kind of being decimated, and as a result, there's loads of massive unused warehouses in the middle of town. Yeah. And so it's often called the second summer of love in the UK, 1980. It kind of covers 2 years really, 1988, 1989. And credited with unlikely side effects like the end of football hooliganism or massive reduction in football hooliganism in the UK, as instead of fighting on the terraces, people are going out to raves on Saturday night and taking ecstasy and not fighting. Yeah. So again, you know, how true that is, hard to say. It's kind of holds water. And so the UK was really the birthplace of that big rave culture, taking it over from the US. But the rest of Europe certainly got involved. This is
I guess only in terms of what's meant by raving, that business of going to somebody else's warehouse and taking over massively disorganised and stuff. Because doesn't that have significant input from the hippie festival?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the next slide that's gonna be about that. But so this, you know, it spreads to Europe. Loads of producers in Holland, Germany, Belgium start making techno acid house as well. Berlin Love Parade started off with 150 people in 1989. By 1999, there were 1.5 million people turning up for this big techno festival. This is a classic German acid house track. But, and as Dan says, in the UK anyway, it sort of combined with the free festival scene and new age travellers. So this had become massive in the UK. Illegal raves, illegal squat parties happening all the time. Police landowners, local residents getting pissed off at you know, drug taking, rubbish not being cleared up. You know, how bad that is, how you know, how well the clean-up operations were done depends on who you ask, but certainly there was conflict. And this culminated in a week-long free festival at Castle Morton Common in the Malverns, you know, beautiful, scenic beauty spot. And then you've suddenly got all these sound systems, all these hippies, New Age travellers, ravers, descending and camping there for a week with no facilities, firing flares at police helicopters and generally making a nuisance of themselves. This is a next generation of acid house music, sort of sounding a lot more polished and produced. Faster, yeah. And from the UK and Europe, it diverged and gave birth to, you know, lots of new subgenres, from sort of like jungle that led to drum and bass, to acid house that just kept getting faster and faster and turned into gabba in Europe, and nosebleed, industrial, all of this stuff. You know, Europe took it on and took it to the next level. But as a result of this going on in the UK, and particularly as a result of Castle Morton, in 1994, this is this is actually this cartoon is actually old from the sun, but it's quite a nice cartoon. But in 1994, the Conservative government had enough and introduced the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, which used this classic phrase and gave the police the power to shut down any event that was playing music characterised by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats.
Three or more people.
Three or more people, right. And so, you know, that was their attempt to define what the problem was and aim this squarely at raves and not, say, an outdoor opera festival, which they're quite happy to let carry on. And it gave police powers to shut it down. You're right. Three or more people?
Three or more people.
Impound all of the equipment and imprison the organisers.
It's still illegal to gather three or more people in the UK in terms of draconian police laws. Four of you get together on a street corner and one of you's phone goes off, you could be busted and imprisoned.
Yeah. So while it was all sort of, you know, quite comic in a way, the attempt to define this music as repetitive beats in a legal act, it worked. It was, although you know, 50,000 people protesting in London riots in Hyde Park, kind of similar effect, if not quite the same scale as the poll tax riots, but it got passed. This is a what year this is from. This is sort of an example of sort of like darker acid house. Next.
You'd get I can't remember who was the Home Secretary at the time, but they sampled him talking about repetitive beats. Possibly one of the most used samples.
Yeah, there were lots of tunes around that time using samples like that. Samples about breaching the peace, which was another thing that these people were getting arrested for in tunes. So, effectively, rave culture, as it stood, was made illegal, and the police used these powers, shut them down, took away the equipment, and all the UK sound systems moved abroad. They just upped and went to Berlin or France, where they could carry on unimpeded by the police. And so in the UK, the rave culture moved back into nightclubs, and we suddenly had this growth of massive super clubs in towns and cities, Ministry of Sound in London, Cream in Liverpool. Heard of those ones? So those were a direct result of what had been going on, being made legal. Interestingly now, there's seems to be sort of, as you say, although these powers still exist, it seems to be a bit more of a move back to illegal parties happening, partly because clubs in big cities are losing their licences and being turned over for development. Big clubs in London, to a certain extent places in Brighton being shut down, and things moving back outside again. And I think last slide, so full circle, another thing that's happened recently is that finally the US, after actually never embracing this culture which they invented, or this music which they invented, now does. And there are now, they call it EDM, electronic dance music, but it's enormous. They have huge festivals. Yeah, but so Burning Man's been going on for a long time, but there's there's one called Tomorrowland, which is enormous, like vast.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, vast scale, enormous sets and stages, massive productions. DJs just sticking in a USB stick and then dancing around, but you know, it's their version of what was happening over here 30 years ago.
What does it sound like? Does
This
sound
is
like,
not-
I was going to say,
I haven't got,
from the early days?
No, I haven't got an
So-
example of US EDM. I won't subject you to that. This is another classic UK one from 1998 that also I think made it into the charts back then. I would have been too young to. I would have been listening to pop music, not. Yeah, so that's my potted history of Acid House. There would be lots more to say about, well, you know, could have chosen lots more tunes, as Dan is suggesting, and a lot more about the social context of it.
What about your period?
How did you get into it, and what do you think is the appeal of this type of music?
It's an interesting one because it's quite, you know, sort of the lack of, as a protest music, if that's what it was, coming sort of late 80s as a reaction to having had 10 years of Conservative government and recession, destruction of industries. Usually you'd expect there to be some words in a protest music. And no, and you know, this is characterised by a lack of words, the odd sample. So it's a strange one because it's not explicitly protesting about anything, but I think it's clear that in both cases, in the US and in the UK, that had something to do with it taking hold or it being created. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Will the next, because I would say that there hasn't been a sort of youth subculture so dramatic as that since then, and you know, there certainly will be one. But what's it going to be? Is it going to be as with the 303? Although it wasn't a technological advance, but it was a new bit of technology that gave rise to Acid House. Will it be a new bit of technology that will give rise to the next musical genre that has the same impact as Acid House did?